אהלן ידידיה, זה רק אנחנו שומעים אחד את השני, נכון? רק ארבעתנו.
נוח יגיד לנו, יכול להיות שכן. מה שלומך?
כן, שומעים טוב. We're just waiting for Rosner. He's just joining us in a sec.
No, but what I'm saying, it's only us here, right? No one else here.
Well, there are people participating that are watching.
The answer is no. Yeah. שלום עינת.
שלום ידידיה.
אהלן עינת.
היי מירה, מה שלומך?
לא יודעת מה עונים על זה. מה עונים על זה?
שלומי כשלומי.
טוב, תודה.
יהיה יותר טוב. זה אולי שהוא יהיה יותר טוב.
היי שמוליק.
Shmuel, do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi,
Great.
how are you?
We're just waiting for Tomer, but perhaps we should get started with today's festivities. So,
No,
welcome.
where are you?
Oh, this is my apartment. Don't you recognize it, Einaz? You blew my cover. I'm in a Zoom background. That's where I am.
Okay. Okay, I'm off the video.
Welcome everybody to the 9th annual JPPI Pluralism Index Presentation. This is our 8th year that we are doing that we did a comprehensive survey of Israeli society. And what we'll do tonight is Shmuel will go through make a presentation, and then we have some people who will respond to it, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So Shmuel Rosner is a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, and he is a prolific everything writer, publisher, and he is the editor of themadad.com, where I'm one of his partners. So Shmuel, please take it away.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be with you this calm evening. There's no noise of protesters, sirens, or any other means outside my house in Tel Aviv. So it's a relatively calm evening in Israel, following a very stormy few weeks, as I'm sure you're all aware. Our survey this year comes right at the end of, or maybe not the end, the end of the beginning of current crisis in Israel, social, political crisis in Israel, and the echoes of this crisis will be seen throughout the data that we are going to present today. Our data is not meant to depress anyone. It is in many ways a path for us to show a positive and constructive way forward. We are going to show some data that could be seen as disturbing, but I think that we also present a lot of data that we can interpret as encouraging and as helpful as we strive to think about the next steps ahead for Israel. Israel is clearly going through some process of self-examination. There are things that need to be sorted out in the next few weeks or few months. And hopefully some of the data that we will show today is going to be helpful with that process. I'll take you to a variety of slides. I'll try to interpret them as best as I can, and we have a wonderful panelist that will later comment on some of the data. So let me begin with a survey we concluded just yesterday. My colleagues in crime in working on this project are Noach Slepkov, who just spoke before me, and Professor Camille Fuchs. Professor Fuchs of Tel Aviv University just yesterday completed another survey that JPPI initiated to look at some of the things that people say and believe amid the current crisis. And this is one nugget of information that I chose to show at the outset by way of explaining how Israel is divided between people who have a different set of readings of Israeli realities. What we see here, we just connected two dots that have no real connection, but they show you how on one pole of the Israeli public, people feel that the group and the leaders who have too much power in Israel are the heads of Haredi parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties. So this is the so-called liberal part or secular part of Israel. In these quarters, we see people who are much afraid of the great power of the leaders of the Haredi society. On the other pole of Israel, we see the people who say, no, the leaders who have too much power are justices of the Supreme Court. These are the people who project too much power, who need to be somewhat weakened. These are the people from which we are afraid. And you see these two points of reference. Who has too much power? One side of Israel say the ultra-Orthodox, the other side says the Supreme Court. These two camps clashed in the last couple of weeks, and with the result that we see today all over Israel. How severe is the crisis that we see in Israel today? I think this is one of the disturbing data points that we are showing today. When we ask Israelis if they believe, or to describe the current crisis from a list of possibilities, as you can see here, overall, there are about 70% of Israelis who say it's either the worst in Israel's history or one of the worst in Israel's history. We offer them points of reference when we ask them the question about the severity of the crisis. It was not a standalone question. We asked about the Yom Kippur War. We asked about the Yitzhak Rabin assassination. We asked about disengagement from Gaza. We asked about 6 or 7 events that were all highly volatile in Israel's history, and yet many people said what we see today is the worst crisis in Israel's history. When we asked Israelis to tell us how the current crisis, what impact the current crisis has on them, what we discovered is quite interesting. For about a third of Israelis, they say it makes them feel a despair of Israel's future, and many say it makes them more combative in their desire to fight for the character or for the future of Israel. And a few people said it was making them more optimistic, or maybe it makes them indifferent to what's happening in Israel. But when we look at specific groups, and especially at those who oppose the judicial reform, the legal reform, that's a camp of about a little more than half of all Israelis. When we look at the specific numbers for them, we see an even divide between the camp, 46% of people who say that this crisis or these recent events make them feel despair for Israel's future. And we find an almost exact same share of people within the group, 43% plus the 2% of people who say that they are more optimistic. So it's 46 versus 45%. One group says it makes me despair. The other group says it makes me want to fight for Israel's future. I think that what we saw in the last couple weeks within the camp of opponents to the legal reform is this tension of people between, well, do we think that Israel is doomed and we are going to give up on it, so to speak? Or do we say, no, this will not pass. We are going to dedicate time and effort and energy, and we are going to fight for a future for Israel that we believe is the right future for Israel. And I think that this tension between despair and energy, fighting energy within this camp, this tension still exists. And what will come out of it is only, we will only discover again in the coming weeks, months, and it might take even years before we understand what really happened in Israel this past couple months. Now I'm moving to the numbers from the larger, more detailed survey of the Pluralism Index that we conducted a few weeks ago. And these are numbers that show us a few things on which we can build, as I said before. And I'll start with this very simple notion of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. We know this cliche, almost a cliche, Israel, Jewish and democratic. We know that in many surveys, people are asked to choose between these two seemingly competing components of character or components of identity. They're asked, is Israel as democratic more important for them, or Israel as a Jewish state more important for them? We decided to take a different path and ask separately about these two values, these two ideas. So we asked the question, how important is it for you that Israel will be a democratic state? And a separate question, how important is it for you that Israel will be a Jewish state? As you can see from these numbers here, especially so if we combine the two upper possibilities, it's very important for me or somewhat important for me. We see that for a vast majority of these numbers are for Israeli Jews. We'll show Israeli Arabs in a second. We can see that for Israeli Jews, for a vast majority of them, it is important both that Israel will be democratic, 98%. There is literally no one who doesn't want Israel to be a democratic state. And we also see 93%, very high number of people who want Israel to be a Jewish state. So when we look at Israel as Jewish and democratic, And one camp, well, we'll see this later, one camp suspects that the other doesn't want Jewishness, and the other camp suspects that the first camp doesn't want Israel to be a democracy. That's false. Almost all Israelis want Israel to be a democratic state and want Israel to be a Jewish state. This is crucially important. When we look at Israeli Arabs, the numbers for a democratic state are almost the same. Almost 90% of them say that they want Israel to be a democratic state, 88%. We also see, and this is not insignificant, that about half of all Arab Israelis, of those who have an opinion, we have 10% who did not express any opinion, but of the others, we see that about half say that they either support Israel being a Jewish state, or they don't care if Israel is a Jewish state, meaning they are willing to live with Israel as a Jewish state. The framing of the question was somewhat different for Jews and Arabs on the question of a Jewish state. And I think there is a reason for encouragement when we see that about half of all Israeli Arabs say, well, we can live with that. Of course, we want Israel to be a democratic state. And as for a Jewish state, we don't actively oppose it. Again, that's true for about half of them. The other half, as you can see, there's 14% who say they prefer that Israel will not be a Jewish state, and 32%, about a third, who say they object to Israel as a Jewish state. When we look at different groups within the Jewish majority in Israel, and we connect all the dots, what we see is that, in fact, the more challenged value among the two is not Israel as a democracy, it is Israel as a Jewish state. In all groups, we can see that more than 3 in 4 people say they support Israel as a Jewish state, as a democratic state. That's the dark blue numbers. When it comes to Israel as a Jewish state, and when we only look at the number for those who say it's very important for them, and don't say it's somewhat important for them, we see that the enthusiasm or the strength of support for Israel as a Jewish state is significantly weaker among secular Jews in Israel. There are only about half of them who say it's very important for them that Israel will be a Jewish state. Again, if we add the very important and the somewhat important, we go back to 90-something%. But clearly you can see here that the importance of the Jewishness of the state is somewhat weaker for secular Jews than it is for the other groups of Jews in Israel. Well, what is a Jewish state and what is a democratic state? We offered people to choose between 3 options. Democratic state means free election and voting rights. That's all, the rule of the majority. A democratic state means values of tolerance and safeguarding of human rights. That's a different possibility. Or a third possibility, both. We want both. We understand, or we believe that a democratic state means something that has both the rule of the majority, but also the value of tolerance, a safeguarding of human rights and minority rights, etc. And as you can see here, among all groups in Israel, there is a clear majority of people who say both. Among the general Jewish population, it's about 80% who say both. Among secular Jews, it's higher. Religious Jews, somewhat lower. And still, it is a majority of secular Jews, religious Jews, right-wing Jews, left-wing Jews, non-Jews. In all groups, we see a preference for the combination of both the rule of the majority and human rights, minority rights. Again, I think this is an encouraging finding. When we asked about the meaning of a Jewish state, what do you mean when you say you wish for a Jewish state? The answer is a Jewish state is a state of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, Medinat Le'om, the people of the Jewish nation. It's not a religious state. And it's interesting to see that both Jews and Arabs have the same interpretation of the meaning of a Jewish state. They both understand the meaning of a Jewish state as a state of a people, of a nation, and not as a state of a religion. Still, we have one group among Jews in which there is not a majority, but a plurality of people who see the religiosity as the main component of a Jewish state and not the nationality or the peoplehood component. That's the ultra-Orthodox group. Among Haredi Jews, the meaning of a Jewish state is more on the, puts more emphasis on the religious component, not the national component. But for all other groups of Jews, it's clear that Israel is a state of the Jewish people, not a state of the Jewish religion. Now I'm going to this issue of perception versus reality, an issue that has huge impact on the psychology of Israelis as they look at the other camp, the other political camp. And what you see here, when we ask right-wing supporters, do you think that the center of and the left are less interested in having a Jewish state? They say yes. Almost 80% of them say yes. 78% say yes. They're less interested. But what is the reality that we've already seen? 90% of centrists and left-wingers in Israel do want Israel to be a Jewish state. So this impression that is created in the heads of people, of Israelis, that the other camp is not a partner in having a state that is both Jewish and democratic, that's a false impression. We see this when we ask rightists about the perception of the center and the left, and we see the same phenomenon when we ask left-wing Israelis, do you think that the right doesn't want Israel to be a strong democracy? They say, yes, we don't think that the right supports democracy. However, the data shows that 94% of right-wing supporters in Israel do want Israel to be a democracy. So again, this perception is somewhat false. I skipped one graph so we can have enough time for everything. What we have here is something that needs a slight explanation. We took 5 statements from Israel's Declaration of Independence, and we asked people to say whether they agree or disagree with these statements without telling them that these are statements from Israel's Declaration of Independence. I assume that some people did recognize the source of these statements because there are, those who have a good education should recognize these statements from the declaration. And I also assume that some Israelis did not recognize these statements and their source. However, or whether they did or didn't recognize the source, they support these statements. Now, these statements include the natural right of the Jewish people to have their own state. They include the state of Israel will be based on freedom, justice, and peace. They include the complete equality of social and political rights. They include the guarantee of freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, language, education, and culture, and they include the call of Israel's founders to the Arab inhabitants of Israel to participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship. Now, am I certain that all respondents clearly understood what they were signing on to? The answer is yes and no, but the numbers here are quite staggering. Again, you see 90% and up of Jewish Israelis supportive of all 5 statements from the Declaration of Independence. When we look at the specific 3 statements that are somewhat more, quote unquote, controversial, those who deal with equality for all people, equality for all viewpoints, etc., we do see that there is a difference between groups in Israel, very strong support on the left, and center, still very strong support on the center right, and somewhat less support on the right wing for 2 of these statements, the one that ensures complete equality of social and political rights, and the appeal to the Arab inhabitants. So there are differences that we must acknowledge between different groups in Israel on these issues. However, when we think about the Declaration of Independence as a starting point for negotiation or for recalibration of Israel's identity and character, I think we have a very good basis to start with the Declaration of Independence that has vast support among Israelis. Just a few more. Religious coercion versus secular coercion. As you can see here, again, we see the flip vision or the opposing readings of reality in Israel, when the more traditional camp feels that it is being coerced by a secular majority, secular coercion, while the other half of Israel, the more secular, less traditional half, believes that it is being coerced by an aggressive religious minority. These 2 competing viewpoints, again, someone who participated earlier in our Hebrew presentation remarked, I think wisely, that every side is somewhat blind to the view of the other side. For secular Israelis, secular coercion is something that they don't even see. For ultra-Orthodox Israelis, the religious coercion is something that they don't see. It's part of their regular, everyday life. So both parties feel coerced without acknowledging that the other side feel a similar coercion by their own camp. Do Jews and Arabs share a common future? This is a comparison between the findings from last year and this year. We don't see a dramatic change. We see a slight increase in the belief of Jews that we share a common future, and a slight decrease in the belief of non-Jews that we share such future. When we ask every year about the contribution of different groups to the well-being and the success of Israel, we see that the trend from 2016 until today is a slight but continuous increase in the appreciation of Israelis, Jewish Israelis, to the contribution of Arab Israelis. It is still a low estimation of the contribution of Arabs, but it is growing, and it is growing quite significantly among seculars. And when we look at similar findings concerning the contribution of ultra-Orthodox, in this case, yeshiva students, to the success of Israel, we see the reverse trend, a slight but continuous decline in the appreciation of Israelis to their contribution to the well-being and success of the state. That is clearly emphasized among secular Israelis. Their appreciation of the contribution of ultra-Orthodox Israelis to the success of Israel is not great, and it's still going down. Last number, again, the trend from 2016 until today, we see that in recent years, the way Israelis feel or the level of comfortability they have in living in Israel as themselves is somewhat declining. We saw the findings were quite positive from 2016 to around 2020 or 2021. And in the last 3 years, we see a decline in the sense of Israelis, that is, that they can feel comfortably in their own skin as part of a larger, pluralistic and tolerant Israeli society. And this is, of course, something that is a challenge for us as we think about the future, the shared future that we all have as Israelis. I'll conclude with that. Thank you so much. And Noach, the floor is yours.
Great. So thank you, Shmuel. Before we move on to some responses from our panelists, I would just like to interrupt this Zoom to thank one of our main sponsors, the William Davidson Foundation, who has generously supported our work from the beginning. This project started by a generous donation from them, so we really appreciate it to the William Davidson Foundation for the support of our work. So I would like to move on to our esteemed panelists. We'll start with Amira Aronovitz, who is the CEO and Director General of the Jewish Agency for Israel. In her 26 years at the agency, she served in various roles, both in the field and in management positions, including Director of Partnership Regions, Director of Budget and Finance, and Vice President for Strategy and Planning. I always like to hear, Rosa and I have been working on this for several months, and we read each other's opinions on it, but it's great to hear an external voice on our findings. So please, Amir, the floor is yours.
So good evening, and thank you, Noach, and thank you, Shmuel, and thank you, Yedidia, for the opportunity and for this important presentation. And I assume all would agree with me that being here today, considering the current situation in Israel, probably makes it even more important. And as we've heard from Shlomo, and as we've read in the research relating to those ideas now, we need to take a note of also the very unique and unprecedented state of what I would relate to as national emergency here in Israel, and intensifying social rift, both at home as well as a growing threat and disintegration to our relationship with world Jewry, which is something that is very much on our concern, as well as issues around our overall security. So hopefully in the last 24 hours, we may be moving to somewhat of maybe constructive path. I would be very modest in saying that, but we're seeing also from the data that it's influenced also by the current moment. When I look at the data from our perspective as the Jewish Agency, I draw two important questions that stand out from the data. And those are around the fact that when we talk about Jewish and democratic state as if it was a self-explanatory concept, we understand that it's not. It surely does not necessarily being interpreted by all the different respondents in a similar way. And what is democracy and what is being Jewish is not necessarily agreed upon. We see that most Israelis, right-wing and left-wing, secular and religious, wants both a Jewish and democratic states. But when we dive into the details, we understand that it's more complicated than what it appears. and apparently they understand it very differently. While 94% of right-wing voters do say they want a democratic state, they tend to understand democracy in a very narrow way. They think it refers mostly to voting and not to civic and human rights as well. We can say that they share the concept of a democratic state with the left center, but not in the same way, whereby the secular voters believe that it's mostly about tolerance and human rights. The same goes when we look at the importance of a Jewish state. Here again, the notion that a majority of Jews want a Jewish state hides a deep disagreement on what Jewish means. We see that 62% of Jewish Israelis and Arabs see the Jewish state as that of the Jewish people, where most religious and Haredi Israelis see it as that of a Jewish religion. And namely, some see Jewish as a shared culture and identity, while others see Jewish as observance of halacha. So again, very different concept indeed. And it made me curious to say, you know, if we were to run this specific survey among world Jewry, we would probably get yet another variation of how they interpret what does it mean to be Jewish and what does it mean to be democratic. And so when I look at this data and I question, you know, what should we draw from it, the Jewish Agency, which at the heart of our work is being this living bridge between world Jewry and Israel, Israel and world Jewry, in a way where we believe there is a clear role to communicate a more nuanced concept of Jewish and Jewish people to the Israeli public. We think we need to put much more emphasis on the peoplehood component, and we've invested in that intensively over the last couple of years in a whole range of programs and strategies, including with the mandatory school system, the Ministry of Education, including using our return shlichim, becoming social agents, change agents in the Israeli society after their eyes have been opened to what does it mean to be Jewish after spending time in Jewish communities, as well as supporting the growth and the expansion of the pluralistic streams in Israel. So in our capacity as somewhat bringing the voice of the Jewish people worldwide, we try to work to educate the entire Israeli society on the need to understand that a Jewish state is that of one that it will be welcoming the entire Jewish people and not just halachic and religiously centered. Hopefully by that, expanding the lens of embracing the fact that being Jewish could mean many more things. My question then becomes more complicated when I think, you know, what role, or is there a similar role with regard to promoting the notion of a democratic, pro-democratic state and democratic education? And if we do believe that democracy should entail a commitment to human rights and toleration, what should be our role vis-a-vis posing this understanding to the Israeli public? I need to be honest, I'm not sure I have an answer as to us at the Jewish Agency having a role, but I definitely know from our conversation, ongoing conversations with our brothers and sisters in world Jewry communities, that this is something that is very much concerning them. And just in the same way that they're looking to influence and shape the fabric of the Israeli society around the interpretation of being Jewish to be a much pluralistic one, they're looking to see the Israeli society becoming more committed to those liberal and pro-democratic values, even before the last couple of weeks, definitely more so now. And so I think that becomes an interesting area for us to consider and to explore together with our partners in communities. What is it that we can do and should do together in order to promote and enable that interpretation of democratic Jew state become one that is more co-aligning with the value and the core beliefs of world Jewry, to then sustain and strengthen the connection between world Jewry and Israel, and make sure this does continue to serve as the homeland for all of the Jewish people, not just the citizens of Israel. This is work that still needs to be done, but this is kind of where I'm at with the data. And thank you. It was fascinating to read the research, and I think gives us a lot of food for thought moving forward.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to our next panelist, I just want to invite everyone who's watching to write questions in the question area, and we will get to those in a couple minutes. But our next panelist Dr. Einat Wilf, a dear friend of mine who I'm always enjoy hearing her speak. After years of listening to her speak, I'm always amazed that she has always something insightful to say. So Einat, please go ahead.
Thank you. It's very kind. So first of all, congratulations for a remarkable and very relevant survey. I think there's a lot there to unpack. First, I must say that contrary to what I expected, I come out of the data very much encouraged. And I think I'm encouraged by the understanding that there are far, far more agreements about the fundamental values and foundational ethos of what Israel is than I think one could imagine from the current discourse. What I will say is I think one of the greatest disservices that has been made was the idea of Israel being as Jewish and democratic. This notion that emerged really in the 90s. And I think it did us a great disservice, which your data actually kind of puts aside, with the notion that one side cares about Jewish and one side cares about democratic. And you show that this perception exists, but it's not the reality. And I think the reality is indeed the reality. And the reason is that if one truly understands the sources of Israel's democracy, I would say that they rely 80% on the fact that Israel is Jewish, about another 18% on the fact that its structure is parliamentary, and the other 2%, which could be this or that institutional arrangement, that's all about it. And we are now fighting about the 2%, whereas our democracy is very strong. It's one of the reasons that throughout this crisis from the beginning, I was not for a single moment concerned to the strength of Israeli democracy. The comparisons that were made, for example, with Poland, with Hungary, with Turkey, I thought them ridiculous. Those are countries that either have never been truly democratic or that have been democratic for about 5 minutes. Democracies ultimately rest on norms, culture, history of a people. And contrary to what some people think, we have a proud democratic history and tradition, even more than the British. So here I will be on Disraeli's side in terms of the Jews versus the British. Our democratic tradition is Israeli. Israel is one of the world's oldest continuous democracies, as odd as it might sound. The Zionist movement is one of the world's oldest democratic institutions. The democratic institutions of the Jews and the diaspora are established. And of course, Judaism is a long established civilization of argumentation and disagreement, going back to Abraham, the Talmud. We draw on that. So as long as Israel's the Jewish state, we are pretty much assured of being a democracy. So it doesn't have to be two ideas as if they're separate. As long as we're a parliamentary system, we are relatively highly secure in being a democracy. Parliamentary systems tend to support democracy more than presidential systems that more easily devolve into authoritarian regimes. And the battle about this or that institutional arrangement between the courts and the Knesset is truly not at the core of what makes Israel a democracy. And I think it has been entirely heartening to look at the data they presented to show that we have much, much more agreements about our foundational ideals and ethos that we would think just by listening to people. So then what should we be concerned about? And I think what we're seeing is something that is common to the crisis of many democracies, is that we believe we have fear of the other. We are being divided And whenever we are being divided, I always ask who is there that wants to conquer and what do they want to conquer? But clearly we are being divided. There exists, and we see it from the data, a broad Israeli center, and yet we are divided into opposing camps where a line is being drawn in the sand, and I'm sure all of us have felt it in recent months. We are demanded even to choose one of the camps to show our allegiance, and the lines are being drawn even stronger, the walls are being built higher, whereas in practice, we have a very powerful center. And I think the tragedy of what's happening in many democracies is that there are powers that are pushing people to oppose each other despite the existence of a center. And I think in that sense, promoting, talking about your findings and your data is clear to dispel the perceptions and the fear of the other. And I think that also goes to, one of the data that I found most amusing, of course, is the perception of the crisis. Seriously, by any objective measure, this is, if people think this is the most difficult crisis in Israel's history, this is a luxurious crisis. And I know from your speaking in other that you said even old people who were in the Yom Kippur War think this is worse. This is, I think, a bit like women after birth forgetting how painful it was. We had more than 3,000 of our best and brightest killed. We now have had people in the streets protesting, and despite some elements of violence, this has been a luxury crisis. Societies where they feel that they're dealing with their deepest issues, with the question of the ethos of the future, that's not what it looks like. The United States went to the second bloodiest war of the 19th century over issues that were considered of similar import. Other countries, of course, saw, deep, violent divides. So the notion of people seeing this as the deepest crisis, I think, is not objective by any measure, but perhaps it does reflect a sense that wars are not real crises in the sense that we're united against a common enemy. And because this is internal, we should view it as more dangerous. I think it goes to a traditional Jewish mythology that the temples are brought down by the Jews or Jewish divisions or Jewish actions. I always found it a very narcissistic view of history. It's never the Babylonians, it's never the Romans, it's what we did. But it is the Babylonians and it is the Romans, and we're not very important in that sense. So the Yom Kippur War was a far bigger crisis. The War of Independence was, this is a luxurious crisis, but I think in terms of perception, people feel perhaps that something that deals with who we are, with internal divisions, somehow feels more serious than combating an external enemy, even though in reality it's not. And I'll just end by saying that the one thing that made me most optimistic is to see that whether people are depressed about what's going on or positive. And I thought it was funny that the more secular were half depressed and half determined. And the funny thing is that it's probably the same people. If you interview me one day, I would be depressed. If you interview me the second day, I would be determined or elated. But what I really found remarkable is that everyone is determined to fight for Israel. So contrary to the perception, for example, that existed for a while, that, left-wing seculars are, ruthless cosmopolitans with second passports who will escape Israel at the first opportunity, what we saw is exactly the opposite. These are people who are determined to fight for Israel. by the way, precisely because I think they understand that Israeliness doesn't travel well. We now have enough experience that to be an Israeli abroad is not an easy experience. And what we've built here is remarkable. And it's not something that we can easily, if at all, take somewhere else. So it's worth fighting for right here. And I think this is at the crux of what's happening right now, is that no one is going anywhere. Everyone is determined to fight for Israel, and everyone wants a voice.
Thank you, Einat. And of course, I should say that Einat is a former member of Knesset and a former senior fellow at JPPI. So I don't see any questions. I will call on our last speaker. Professor Yedidia Stern is the president of JPPI and a law professor at Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law, where he also served as the dean. And he has been working tirelessly the last several weeks to solve the problem of Israel's democracy crisis, or lack thereof.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Noah. Thank you, Shmuel and Camille. Thank you, Amira and Einat. Thank you all. Listen, we just experienced a very special moment in our national life. We Israelis, we are used to display heroism in a battle, in a war, but what we experienced right now was heroism, which was basically a civic one. And to us Israelis, to be heroic on the public sphere, facing brothers, was a special moment, and I think we have to cherish it. And I think that the index that Shmuel, Noah, and Camille showed us may explain why there was no violence in the street last week. You have to realize that there is a huge difference between the way society here in Israel is and the way it is being perceived and the way its politics behaves. I think that most Israelis do enjoy each other, very high standard of solidarity between brothers, its history and its reality, and our efforts to be together are ongoing, non-stop, every day, every year for the last 75 years. So when we have a clash between politicians and camps, the clash takes a non-violent form, and the clash is, I would say, maintained by the basic idea that we are one. When we look in the data, we see that almost all of us believe we should be democracy, and almost all of us believe we should be a Jewish state. As Amira said, the interpretation of these two terms obviously are in dispute. But the basic idea that Israel should be Jewish and democratic state is undisputed. I think that we have different evaluation about reality, whether we are democratic enough and or Jewish enough. But we share the vision of Jewish and democratic state, and this is a big deal. Now, I was quite amazed to see, Shmuel, that you found out that 87% of Jews in Israel are willing to treat Israeli Arabs on the basis of full and equal citizenship. If they understood what they agreed to, this is great news. Reality might be a bit different, but nevertheless, this is a very impressive piece of information. I think much of the data in the Pluralism Index is basically a call for action. We see that we have very good foundations that we can use and build upon them. We at JPPI are trying to do it non-stop. I'll just use one piece of information in order to show what we're doing on the basis of the data that Shmuel, Noach, and Camille put in front of us. You see, in a month from now, we are going to experience the 75th birthday of the State of Israel, and this will be also the 75th birthday of the Declaration of Independence. And Shmuel showed us that basically all of us agree to the main arguments and declarations in the Declaration. Meaning, this is a text which is almost a holy text, in the secular sense of the word holy, in Israeli society. Now, in the last few months, it seemed to some of us that the Declaration became some kind of a tool for the left in Israel, or for the liberal for Israel, against the right-wingers. So much so that when I approached the Mif'al HaPais lottery in Israel and asked them to finance some kind of project that we at JPPI wanted to do in order to bring back the Declaration to the people, Mif'al HaPais, the lottery, after a lot of thinking, said we cannot support this effort because the Declaration is in dispute. Well, Shmuel, Noah, and Camille show us this is not true. The Declaration is being embraced by all Israelis, basically. And we should be very happy about it. Now, the Jewish Agency and JPPI just finished preparing a class, online class, teaching the Declaration to young Israeli adults, and it will be broadcasted to all Israeli soldiers in the IDF, to everybody, right after Yom HaAtzmaut. This will be some kind of another experience, pushing young Israelis to solidify their identity around equality, Jewish state, and democratic state. I hope that this kind of efforts will go on not only with JPPI, but with the Education Ministry. We are pushing also the Education Ministry in Israel to make the Declaration part of civic studies in a very, I would say, innovating ways. And I will tell you about it once we'll do it. But this will become the basic equipment of every Israeli kid. The Declaration is yours. Learn it, adapt it, and act upon it. So to sum it up, I think that despite the ongoing fight here in Israel about identity, we enjoy a solid base that we share. And despite some rumors, Israelis are very happy people. You know, the UN just published some kind of international index of happiness around the globe. And Israel came number 4 of all the countries around the globe being happy. So I think the Pluralism Index might explain why we are happy and we're looking forward to the next 75 years of independence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yedidia, and thank you to our panelists and for everyone who joined us this afternoon. Chag Sameach, and we'll see you again next year. And of course, the full report is available on JPPI's website, jppi.org.il. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.